Welcome. For this session, I would like to speak with you about this philosopher, Michel Foucault. We are going to take a look um, at a couple of his writings, the first of which will be his book called The History of Sexuality. You will notice the book is divided into four parts. I'll try to deal with the very first section, but actually the book um, encompasses four books, so it is now a tetralogy, which deals with a huge range of topics. So we will have to parse out the different topics of the book. Even though it is named The History of Sexuality, I believe the book is really about power. And I encourage you to interpret it primarily as a book about power. And I think we'll see why as we get through the different sections, and in particular the different questions of discipline and the state. So before getting into the details of this text, I will just introduce you to this particular thinker. Michel Foucault was a 20th century French philosopher, sociologist, historian, living from 1926 to 1984. He is born into a fairly wealthy family in Poitiers, France, and becomes a professor of philosophy and sociology at the Collège de France. Even though his training is in philosophy, he has a lot of background in the histories of psychology, psychiatry. He is deeply interested in the history of prisons, and we will spend time in his book, Discipline and Punish, looking at the history of the prison. So really, he is interested in different institutions of control and institutions of confinement. He is not a classically abstract philosopher. He is more interested in histories of institution and histories of social relations. And as I said before, he is really a theorist of power. I think he introduces a very novel concept of power throughout his whole life. One of the key ideas of Foucault is the deep connection he believes there to exist between power and knowledge. All of his books, in one way or another, are looking at a history of an institution which creates a body of knowledge in a manner that is powerful. So he has, actually his dissertation was an enormous book called The History of Madness, which was a history of psychiatry and psychology, and really a concrete analysis of the asylum in the 19th century. And Foucault shows there that actually there was a history that produced a science, that produced a knowledge, namely the study of mental illness, which at the same time acted as a new kind of power control, a new kind of power relation between people, insofar as people now deemed mentally ill were also confined or excluded from aspects of society. So he'll be always interested in how knowledge is never a neutral science, but that science are always mechanisms of control and power. So how does power influence our relevant ideas in society, and how does power for Foucault exist in a manner that is hard to locate in one specific place in society? Foucault will have, I think, a much more diffuse and relational concept of power. He does not believe the power of any particular society can be found in one person or one institution. In Hobbes, if you remember, the power of society was in the sovereign, in the state. We could go forward and say maybe in Marx, the power is in the capitalist class, or is at least in capital and money. Foucault disagrees that you can ever find power in one place, but it has to do with the relationships between people that makes power what it is. And this is also a book about identity. and how the making of myself, the making of my identity, is itself a part of a wider story about power, and that how often when we think we are crafting an identity or shaping an identity, we actually are playing into the hands of power on some level. And so we'll try to see how that pertains to institutions of sexuality and the construction of identities of sexuality. So as I said, his first book, Madness and Civilization, or really the original title, History of Madness, is published in 1960, and it's a very massive, sweeping history of the emergence of modern psychiatry. He then turns his attention in 1963 to hospitals and to medicine. He believes if you want to understand what power is, you have to look at how medicine operates and how actual human beings are studied and observed. And so he does that in this book, The Birth of the Clinic. Probably his most successful philosophical book is this book called The Order of Things, which sort of made him kind of an intellectual philosophical celebrity in France in 1964. And there he goes through a deep history of a number of different disciplines in the humanities and social sciences. So in a way, it was a kind of an analysis of the relation between power and knowledge in general. And then his big book on prisons is called Discipline and Punish. And it's there, I think, that Foucault makes a little more concrete, perhaps, his analysis of power as a relationship, and one that is deeply, deeply connected up with surveillance. We'll see that actually the shift from a power of sovereignty that would be located in the state to one of micro power or disciplinary power will have a lot to do with the function of surveillance in modernity. And then we get this tetralogy now of history of sexuality, which will range from modernity, but actually in the next and third book go all the way back to ancient Greece and the ancient Roman worlds, and then I guess in the fourth to early Christian context. So it's a very sweeping history. Now, this book has a context, of course, and Foucault, really good, I think, actually, at not only writing finished books, but giving a lot of lectures as he's researching to sort of illustrate or expound upon why exactly he is taking up these particular questions in perhaps a more conversational way. So during this period of his life, he leaves France periodically to lecture in New York and California. In particular, gets quite a wide audience in California at places like Berkeley, where his popularity really takes off. And there he gives very wide lectures on power, sovereignty, and sexual identity. He also does very concrete work for prison reform, both in the US and in Europe. And it's Foucault, not just a theoretical philosopher, but also an activist at various points. And probably it would be impossible to imagine gender studies and queer theory even existing without Foucault, the contribution of Foucault's theory on identity, and we'll see why, I think, as we make it through this book. But I would say that is one of his lasting legacies. One of the key concepts of Foucault's work is the idea of biopower, incredibly relevant concept for today. We won't get too much of an analysis of biopower in the beginning of the history of sexuality, but by the end of the unit, I think we'll have a pretty well-rounded idea of what he means. But I think the first shift he's really looking for or pointing to is how traditional power, or at least power for a lot of human history, was sovereign power. That is this classical story that power is with the king or with the monarch, and it's a very simple power, right? You just have a state, The state imposes laws, and if you fail to obey the laws, you get punished. Right. So that's a very classical understanding of power as you get in Hobbes and Locke. Foucault argues that that's not really the way power works anymore. There are states, of course, and states are powerful, but power is much more a kind of regulation of health and sex. It is biological and also scientific and technological as well. So sovereign power you can understand as the power of the state to take life, right? So this is really the key question of, or the key threshold marker of a sovereign modality of power. It's the right of the state over life. Biopower defined here is a relational power over life. It's the relations people have with each other over what life is going to be, and what who has the right to life, who does not, who has the right to exist within the spaces and institutions of society, and who does not. And again, there's no one place to locate biopower. It seems to be much more diffuse and kind of dispersed throughout the whole of a society. So what is Foucault actually saying when he says, I'm going to write a history of sexuality? That seems to be a ridiculous and way too big of a topic, right? It seems to be, kind of a book that would be infinite, really, if you were to be serious about a history of sexuality. The first thing he indicates is that he is not writing a history of sex. In other words, he's not interested in the many different catalog of acts of sex that would constitute human behavior. That would be more like an encyclopedic approach to history and to the topic of sex. He is more interested in the concept of sexuality as a shifting and social concept. So you'll notice the book actually does not have very many descriptions of sex in it at all. In fact, Foucault at various points says sex is not even particularly interesting, really. It's actually kind of a sort of a strangeness of modern society that we are so interested in it. What he's more interested in are the relevant social and historical factors that have contributed to a concept of sexuality, and how that concept of sexuality plays a role in power. All right, so just hold in mind that difference between sexual act, history of sexual act, and a history of the concept of sexuality. They're different ideas. So what is the history of this concept? The first claim you can already see that Foucault believes is relatively new is that the concept does have a history. In other words, the concept of sexuality that we basically believe in or operate with as essentially normal in modernity is a different concept than existed in the medieval period of Europe. That concept was probably very different from the ancient world, and so on. So even the idea of the concept of sexuality having history is a part of Foucault's argument. Part of his thesis is that this phenomenon, sexuality, is historical. So of course, one of the big kind of contexts of the book is the sexual revolution of the 1960s. This was meant to be a massive kind of social upheaval that revolutionized the norms regarding what would be acceptable vis-a-vis sex. 1968 is a particularly key year in French society. It's actually a big year throughout the entire globe, but in France, there was almost a political revolution. And in addition to being a Marxist revolution in part, in other words, a revolution against capital, it was also a revolution against dominant sexual mores of the bourgeoisie. One of the key facilitators of that revolution was the introduction of the birth control pill, which made possible sex before marriage, of course, in a kind of liberality of sexual behavior in a way that was not possible before. So we had before the 60s, possibly a period of much more stringent control on sexuality and sexual behavior. 68 represents a sea change where the old mores are no longer quite as widespread. That's just a little bit of context, and probably Foucault would want to understand his book as not coming from out of nowhere, but actually coming from out of that context and coming from out of that sea change. And I'll circle back to kind of why the idea of sexual permissiveness or sexual liberality is a problem for him. Now, key problems of the book: how has human sexuality changed over time? Can we point to any major differences in how we understand human sexuality in modernity, a period which for Foucault basically means 1900 up to the present day? Are the dominant mainstream ideas regarding human sexuality different in modernity than in previous times? And if so, why did they change? What is the relation between sexuality and power? Clearly, as I say, the book is going to be about power and how maybe power exercises itself over us. But what is the precise relation between human sexuality and power? And already you could probably see Foucault's hand a little bit, his cards showing that there will be indeed a very significant relationship between sexuality and power. And how does sexuality constitute or represent a body of knowledge? In other words, sexuality is not just a set of actions, but actually will constitute what he calls a discourse, or in other words, a whole sort of kind of way of understanding oneself and understanding society. And then one of the questions that will be the focus of the first part of the book is this question of repression. And so the main person that you should have in mind, I think, that Foucault is in dialogue with here above all, is Sigmund Freud, right? If you remember from Freud, Civilization is Discontent, he argued that the whole of civilization is really the product of sexual repression. Foucault is going to call into question whether or not that really makes sense. He has his doubts about this thesis regarding renunciation or repression. So that will be a kind of act of skepticism that Foucault will bring to bear on Freud. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, what does it mean to create a sexual identity? In other words, if I define myself sexually as, let's say, homosexual, heterosexual, or whatever, what am I really doing? What do I really mean when I say I have an identity? Foucault is deeply, deeply interested in kind of conceptually and historically what is at stake in that identity. Now, Foucault's claim, or one of the theses of his book, is that human sexuality is not a natural fact or a kind of prepackaged given. He will point to the historical or social constitution of sexuality as an evolving relationship or an evolving identity that is crafted over time. So he actually turns to Friedrich Nietzsche and is very influenced by Nietzsche, whose genealogy of morality showed, if you remember, that the very idea of good and evil changes over time, much as the concepts of good and evil have flip-flopped through different political and social revolutions. Foucault will similarly argue that our relevant ideas and norms regarding sexuality have undergone significant transformations too. And sexuality is itself always going to be mediated by power relations and power asymmetries within any given particular society. So I would say just the first kind of idea here, the first thing that's important is that sexual identity is not a neutral phenomenon. It is deeply embedded in power and institutions of power, knowledges of power, and discourses of power. So sexuality is mobilized to create an identity. In other words, a big aspect of my own identity or my understanding of self is bound up with my sexuality. But what is kind of interesting and perhaps liberatory about that is that my sexuality, because it is not a natural given and is socially constituted, it means that my identity itself is constituted or socially made, not a natural given. So things like sexual orientation or sexual history and different sexual acts are often identified with a person. And so sexuality, we have this way, perhaps kind of in a weird way, Foucault seems to suggest, of identifying it as a property of the person, as an inherent or natural property of the person. So even the very idea of kind of using this language, like I have a sexuality, my sexuality is X, Foucault thinks is somewhat of a problem and somewhat incoherent. And part of the reason why it is incoherent is because I can't really be said to have what is made in the first place, namely that identity. So he is kind of trying to get us to at least call into question the idea of my identity as a fixed and static set of properties, and to think about it more as a relational dynamic process, something that is in motion and therefore not fixed and not static. So he writes on 105, sexuality must not be thought of as a kind of natural given, which power tries to hold in check, or an obscure domain, which knowledge tries gradually to uncover. So sexuality is not just like some secret that I have in me that power is trying to rein in or regulate, nor is it some secret private aspect of me that knowledge is trying to reveal, because that would be a kind of reification of one's sexuality, a treatment of what is processed into a thing. So Foucault is trying to dismantle typical approaches to how sexuality is mistakenly viewed as either repressed or pried loose, as it were. Now let's have a look a little bit at why Freud was wrong, according to Foucault. I would say this is the first major claim of the section of volume 1 of the History of Sexuality called We Other Victorians. And if you remember from Sigmund Freud, really all of human behavior is kind of an act of repression of sex, right? And Freud had this kind of model of my sexuality as being some hidden secret of my unconscious mind. It's not that it's a secret that human beings have sex, of course, but the idea that my motives and my psychology is really a sexual drive or a sexual instinct that gets disguised in various things like sublimation or repression is a very Freudian analysis of human behavior. So the repression of sexuality would be, in the Freudian model, the cause of mental illness and the cause of so many symptoms. And the practice of psychoanalysis for Freud was that we would kind of, through talk therapy, through free association, we would shine the light on your unconscious, and therefore by extension, we would shine the light on your sexuality that you are repressing from others and from yourself. Foucault hated this idea that sexuality was somehow a thing living in the deep recesses of your mind, and that you had to shine the light on it in order to have an honest relationship to yourself. He thought this was a simplification of human sexuality. So the repressive hypothesis is Foucault's way of pointing out to a narrative that is commonly believed in regarding the Victorian era and the kind of story of repression that Freud made so popular. And a simple version of the repressive hypothesis is this, that in modernity, in particular in the Victorian age, we all repressed our sexuality. So the idea was, if you think about the politics and social mores of Victorianism, that idea was meant to be we're just hiding sexuality, right? So the Victorian era was marked by or characterized by an extensive and very visible repression of sexuality. And it was in that context that Freud launched his popular theory of the unconscious, because it seemed to be responding to what was negative or prohibitive about the Victorian era in the early 1900s. So the Freudian story, of course, you know now, is that repression of instincts and repression of the sex drive in particular is the cause of society's modern discontent. And in a way, the project of psychoanalysis was that there was a close association or equation of freedom with not being repressed, or at least understanding your repression. So the repressive hypothesis not only speaks to the repression that was supposed to be existing in Victorian modernity in Europe, but also to the overcoming of that repression. So the modern world after the Victorian age is said to have liberated itself from its own repression. So the common narrative is, it's hard to periodize exactly, but let's say late 19th century to early 20th century is an age of deep repression. Through the birth of psychoanalysis, psychiatry, and medicine, humanity frees itself from that repression, and now in the 60s and 70s is free. So this would be the conventional understanding of a modern sexuality. Foucault's first argument is that this history is false. It is not accurate. It is both empirically inaccurate to how people acted during this time, and it is also conceptually false in terms of how people even understood their own sexuality. The first idea here, or maybe not first, but the kind of reason why the repressive hypothesis cannot possibly be true is that sexuality was not, in fact, repressed during the Victorian era. And the reason why it was not actually repressed was because people were thinking about it constantly. This simply follows from the fact that people were paying so much attention, or had such an attitude of fascination towards human sexuality. If you think about the literature of this period, it is all about love and jealousy and betrayal, and love triangles. So all of the imagination of people during this time was on sexuality. It didn't matter that people were wearing clothes that was, covering their skin. Even the act of wearing that clothing is a symptom of being fascinated or preoccupied by sexuality. So if it's on the one hand false that people were actually repressed in the Victorian era, it will be equally false that people are now free in modernity in the 20th century. So he will call into question not only the narrative historically, but the conceptual structure of moving from repression to liberation as the source of freedom. Now, some three additional arguments, I think, that try to round out, in a way, the falsehood of the repressive hypothesis. The first pertains to the fact of the matter on repression and whether or not it empirically was true. And I think the second is a more important argument or question, really, that Foucault raises as a skeptic, which is that the idea that power is merely a matter of repressing, right? I think what he's really trying to do in this book is to challenge our assumption that power is just about saying no to something. Foucault will suggest that actually power is much more controlling of you when it invites you to say yes, or when it says yes to you and invites you in. So power relations in society are not necessarily repressive. They are not necessarily about restriction and control. Power is actually also facilitating and inviting of certain behavior. And three, was there truly an age of repression followed by an age of liberation? Can we cleanly split the 1900s up from repression on the one hand to a post-68 age of liberation? Foucault is highly dubious of this. So let's look a little bit more at why the repressive hypothesis might be wrong in terms of Foucault's alternative concept of power. As I said before, power is not simply a prohibition on how to act or what to think or what to do. Foucault writes in various places throughout the history of sexuality that power is productive of something. In other words, power does not simply imprison you or keep you in a cage, although it can do that, but power is productive of an identity. In other words, power is something that solicits something out of you or induces you to become something that you are not necessarily. So power, again, is not located in one place, in one institution. So a classic part of the repressive hypothesis was that it's really religion and the morals of the church that are repressing us. Foucault wants to suggest that that's a very simplistic understanding of how power suffuses throughout society, and power is not going to be in a place at all, really, but is going to be operating in the relations between people. So he will use the metaphor of a network, I think, over and over again, both in the context of sexuality, but also in the context of prison, to show the relational character of power. Power has much more to do with my relation with others, my relation with the bodies of knowledge that I am myself partaking in, and my own self-understanding, my own self-consciousness, to use some more existential language. So power is a network in which it is unclear exactly where the coerciveness of power exactly lives or where it exists. So Foucault writes early in the book on 17, when one looks back over these last 3 centuries with their continual transformations, things appear in a very different light. Around and apropos of sex, one sees a veritable discursive explosion. So we're going to have to spend a fair amount of time unpacking this idea of a discourse, of what is discursive. But suffice it to say for the moment that he says, far from being an age of repression or hiding sex, the Victorian period was actually a veritable explosion around the idea of sex. In other words, the concept of sexuality becomes an almost obsession with people, and more talk and more consideration or fascination with human sexuality exists than before. So the repressive hypothesis cannot be true if there was a discursive explosion around human sexuality. So again, sex is not just an act. It is not just a question of what is happening behaviorally, but it has more to do with how we are understanding it. So sex is not equivalent to sexuality. Sexuality is a much broader concept that encompasses norms and habits and identities and ways of relating. And so it is a mistake to simply equate the act with the concept. And sexuality becomes a discourse in the sense that it becomes an entire mode of representing human existence. In other words, for Foucault, a discourse is both a body of knowledge, of data and information, but also a kind of way of relating to oneself in relation to others. It becomes an actual claim upon how I should live my life normatively. So for Foucault, discourse is kind of a combination of speech, ideas, values, morals, and scientific knowledge that operates in a way almost behind my back, almost without me knowing it, about what sexuality is and what it ought to look like. So sexuality as discourse is Foucault's way of expanding what we typically mean by sexuality to encompass things like ideas, value, morality, and scientific fact together. So we have a kind of false idea about sex as opposed to sexuality. And there's a kind of false naturalization of sex that we typically operate with as a kind of taken for granted conflation of sex and sexuality. We tend to, at least in conventional understandings, view the whole horizon of sex as merely a natural or biologically given program. But Foucault wants to say that our sexuality extends vastly beyond the mere biological. It's not to say that our biology is irrelevant to our sexuality. Obviously, sexuality is mediated deeply by the natural instinct for reproduction, let's say, but there's a whole kind of myriad of attitudes and norms which are not simply a matter of our biology. So sexuality should be viewed as a cultural, social, and historical product, which is has a kind of genealogical history, to use Nietzsche's language. So sex and sexuality constitute each other through discourse. This is Foucault's way of saying that actually the very act by society of speaking, prescribing, evaluating, and studying sex is part of what gives sexuality its reality. So how do power relations influence sexuality, if not through repression? In other words, how could power be shaping sexuality if it is not simply about saying no or saying something that would be a prohibition on a particular sexual act or a particular sexual identity? Foucault tries to overcome this problem through a concept he calls the incitement to discourse. And this is basically one of the major ways in which modern society exerts power over sexuality in a way that is not negative, but is productive. So the idea here is that society has a way through discourses of inspiring or incentivizing, you could say maybe inviting people to speak about their sexuality, and for Foucault, to speak about it constantly. So there's something in our society, for a variety of complex historical reasons, which is no longer really in the business of repressing our own sexual history and acts, but actually by getting us to confess it over and over again and to broadcast it in as public a way as possible. So power in modernity is not repressing sex primarily, but is shaping it by making it a public discourse, by turning it into something that a collective spotlight can shine on. All right, so we're going to have to kind of unpack further the different specifics of this incitement to discourse. Foucault writes at the level of discourses in their domains, however, practically the opposite phenomenon occurred. There was a steady proliferation of discourses concerned with sex, specific discourses, different from one another, both by their form and by their object, a discursive ferment that gathered momentum in the 18th century onward. So modernity, he's saying, is characterized by a steady proliferation of discourses concerned with sex. So more and more talk, more observation, more norms are circulating and being made about sex. So there cannot be a repression of sex if there is at the same time a proliferation of discourses. So Foucault will have to, and I think this is really what he does throughout the whole remainder of the tetralogy, is to give us the different examples of discourses concerning sex. One will be religion, one will be science, but there will be others as well. So what we're going to have to look at in greater detail as we move through the book is how the repressive hypothesis is overturned by the incitement to discourse. We'll look at the concept of sexuality in terms of the production of an identity. And Foucault, we will see, argues that actually the very idea of having a sexual identity is incredibly modern, did not exist in previous times. And the incitement to discourse will turn on kind of what he calls a kind of act of confession, or a societally solicited act of confession. So that will be kind of the key to unpacking the history of sexuality. And we will see that actually towards the end of the first part of the book, he will expand the entire topic from sexuality to the very question of what he calls disciplinary power, or biopower in general. And that will essentially feed into the arguments about surveillance and control in the context of the prison.